Falkreath Hold, Skyrim's second southernmost region, known for its misty forests and seemingly endless greenery. It's a beautiful hold home to the towns of Helgen and, of course, Falkreath, a township known for its association with death. Famed for having the largest cemetery in Skyrim, it would seem the very premise of mortality has become something of a regional pride. But death appears to be rampant throughout the rest of the hold, from werewolf troubles to being home to the literal Dark Brotherhood, and of course who could forget Helgen being wiped off the map. Falkreath Hold has its fair share of bloody stories, and perhaps one of the bloodiest lays waiting at Half Moon Mill. Now, what makes Half Moon Mill a curious place is the nature of its occupants. But before I get carried away, it's situated here, on the southern shore of Lake Ilanalta. It's a rather run-of-the-mill mill, comprised of a humble abode, a shed, and a sawmill, accented of course by an all-important river. You may very well have passed this location dismissing it as somewhere of minimal consequence. After all, it is a sawmill in Falkreath Hold. It's about as out of place as a book in a library, and by that I mean, of course, not at all. However, what is out of place are the details. Chief among them, the occupants, Hearn and Hurt, both of whom look different from your average Nords. Not that I'd necessarily be able to put my finger on it. Jokes aside, it's obvious these two are not your average loggers. There's something more sinister to them, and if that's not adequately conveyed through their burning orange eyes and prominent brow lines, not to mention their deathly pale skin, then the disquieting point is further made apparent by their dialogue.
Lone travelers can find these woods a little treacherous. We've been looking for someone to join us in the hunt.
Hearn and I do so adore guests. These guards are such a bore.
Do you get many guests?
We have guests as often as we can, but there aren't a lot of travelers these days. The war keeps people off the roads.
Do you like it out here, away from everything?
Other people just make things complex. Out here, Hearn and I can get everything we need from the occasional traveler.
It would seem the Nord lumberjack Hurt here has something of a fixation on having guests, while also expressing dissatisfaction at the presence of guards. If Hurt's dialogue here is to be reliable, she and Hearn take enjoyment out of having guests, and may even offer that we stay a while, which may give these two the appearance of a hospitable couple, but when you take note of their actual appearance, it's quite easy to see through to the double meaning. If it wasn't obvious, Hearn and Hurt are vampires, a revelation that takes an awful lot less prying thanks to the Dawnguard DLC, that sort of revamped how vampires look. As in the original release of the game prior to the installation of the Dawnguard DLC, their vampiric looks were far more subtle. So though their piercing aesthetic gives the game away virtually instantaneously, this isn't how the story was intended to unravel. The now obvious revelation of this detail is just a tragic victim of reworking the average vampire's appearance in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim to make them look more menacing for the Dawnguard expansion. Regardless of whether or not they intended for the cat to be out of the bag this early, it's clear we're not supposed to trust these people. Their dialogue has something of a sly tone, something that's meant to put us off, and since it's painfully obvious they're vampires blending into society, it's entirely unlikely that they mean well. But before we get carried away with speculating what they plan to do with us, that they probably can't thanks to the presence of a nearby guard rendering the risk of exposing themselves not worth it, let's first explore what it means to be a vampire in the Elder Scrolls universe, and whether or not that means Hurt and Hearn might innately mean harm. Effectively, vampires are creatures that feed on the blood of the living. In the Elder Scrolls, they're considered to be a form of undead, and their affliction is caused by a series of diseases that can lead to vampirism, typically spread by other vampires. So a close encounter with a vampire not only poses a severe risk to one's life on account of the bloodthirstiness, but should you survive such a confrontation, your chances of becoming a vampire yourself are quite high. Meaning, of course, among mortals, vampires are as feared as they are hated. Therefore, firstly, on account of the fact that they're not being driven from the region by an angry mob, we can deduce that Hurt and Hearn's vampiric status is something of a secret. Because if their bloody nature was to be revealed, I doubt they'd be tolerated. Does this mean by default they mean ill towards their neighbours and passing travellers? Not necessarily. There are instances of good vampires out there. For instance, in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, we encounter Count Janus Hassildor of Skingrad, who, as it turns out, is also a vampire. However, it appears he means well for the people of Skingrad, who in return hold him in very high regard. And despite this, Count Skingrad embracing the changes within himself, he doesn't hold an incredibly high opinion on other vampires, citing the reason that they've given in to their animal urges, so it is possible for vampires to retain their humanity. It is, however, not awfully common. That said, there are other examples, but I mention this one in particular because, well, there's a flip side. The Count's wife, Rona, was also a vampire, but she was unwilling to accept her condition, refusing to feed, resulting in something of a comatose state. So what we can gather is though vampires can't die, at least not this way due to the fact that by Elder Scrolls logic they aren't technically alive, they still need to feed on the life force of others, i.e. blood, in order to maintain their animated state. Though probably for meta reasons this doesn't appear to be the case for all vampires, but let's just say chances are good Hurt and Hearn need to feed. And feed they most certainly do. On the property we can find a tree stump upon which there's a rabbit, a two-pronged fork, and a bottle of mead. It's an interesting culinary decision, but who am I to judge if food isn't ungodly spicy and unsettling to my stomach? I don't want it. Now I can't imagine a small mammal is the most ideal source of warm blood that a vampire could consider. Would it be enough to keep the hunger at bay? Perhaps short term, but long term? Certainly not. And Hurt's dialogue would suggest they do indeed hunt larger prey.
Out here, Hearn and I can get everything we need from the occasional traveler.
I wonder what a vampire would need from a traveller. Furthermore, Hearn implies that he and Hurt like to go hunting, and this modest frail shack appears to contain some of their hunting spoils. It's a bloody old place with an assortment of meats that doesn't look out of place from a mile away. But upon closer inspection this may come across as a radical thought, but that's an incredibly funny looking deer. The presence of bloodied human remains in a shack owned by two blood-sucking vampires is no coincidence. It would seem therefore they are indeed killing people and consuming their blood, and this dark revelation is arguably unsurprising. These wretched beings may very well be blended with society, but the only logical conclusion is that's because the appearance of two lone loggers in the woods is as good a pretense as any. It would seem as though they're outwardly assimilated with mortals because it provides them with opportunities to single out prey, and that method appears to have been working for them for some time. And you don't have to look far beyond the vicinity of Half Moon Mill to find another potential victim of theirs. To the ever so slightly northwest, for instance, we can find a bloodied cairn of some description, and by that we have the incredibly pale remains of a dark elf. He was wearing clothes when I arrived, by the way. I simply removed them to make it more apparent. I promise, based on his apparel, he doesn't strike me as the adventurous type, so whatever happened to him, I doubt he put up much of a fight, but noticeably there are no real visible injuries on his remains. However, blood on the stones at this location suggests some bleeding has occurred. The theory goes perhaps this Dunmer was a vampire's meal, or at least his blood, and by extension his life force was, as it is interesting that there's an uncharacteristically pale corpse of a dark elf, only a bag full of paces, from the abode of not one, but two vampires. And if he was indeed an easy target, something tells me they would have gone for him. After all, they do get what they need from the occasional passing traveller, and this rather unfortunate fellow does fit that bill quite adequately indeed. So all evidence points to these two vampires actively indulging in their desire for the blood of mortals, and Falkreath Hold appears to be their hunting ground. So perhaps now is the time to snoop around their abode and see what's what. It's a rather homely looking home.
Oh my, a guest.
And our rather scary hosts appear to be quite accommodating. There's nothing awfully out of the ordinary for a Skyrim home in here, aside from maybe the burning glare of Hurt and Hearn's glowing eyes, and once you've snooped around a bit they may ask you to leave. But before we comply, there are a couple of things of note in here. If you check all the containers, it would seem Hurt and Hearn have quite the assortment of clothes, which within itself is not abnormal. But some of these articles of clothing are specific and widely different, from robes to rags. Perhaps they're repurposing the clobber of those they've killed, or maybe they're using them as disguises to lure in victims. The most likely explanation is they just have an awful lot of clothing. But considering everything else we've learned about Hearn and Hurt, I couldn't help but notice how vast the range is. The other noteworthy thing in here is under the bed we can find a copy of an oddly specific book, titled Experimentation in the Physicality of the Werewolf, which is a study in the physical nature of lichens, and documents the author, Raymond Crex's experimentations on afflicted subjects that result in their deaths. It is not what I consider to be appropriate bedtime reading material, which makes me wonder, why would these vampires take an interest in lycanthropy? The way I see it, there are two possibilities. The first one is, of course, in the Elder Scrolls you can't be a vampire and a werewolf at the same time, so perhaps they are looking to become werewolves to cure their vampirism. Not only that, being a werewolf would provide them with immunity from contracting vampirism in the future, but they don't appear to have a problem with their current nature. Alternatively, perhaps they're having werewolf trouble and they're learning more about their foe's kind so they can face it with greater odds of success. Off the top of my head, I can think of two werewolves in Falkreath Hold, Sinding, who's presently incarcerated in Falkreath, and a member of the Dark Brotherhood, Armbjorn.
Here's all you need to know. I'm a werewolf. I like killing things. I love Astrid. I hate annoying people. And the color blue gives me a headache.
He's a rather aloof man of limited imagination by the sounds of things, but the premise of a werewolf Dark Brotherhood assassin becomes infinitely more interesting when you realise there's a Dark Brotherhood contract on the head of Hearn. Provided you've done Nazir's previous batch of miscellaneous contracts, after a certain point in the Dark Brotherhood questline, a new batch becomes available.
As it turns out, I've got two new contracts. One rather easy assignment, and another that should prove quite a challenge. Your first target is an orc bard named Lurbuk. The other is a vampire by the name of Hearn. Happy hunting.
Tell me about Hearn.
He's a vampire and has blended into human society for years. He's never far from his female companion, Hurt, also a vampire. The contract is for the male Hearn, but you'll probably have to contend with the female too. So for Sithis' sake, watch yourself.
This not only blesses us with a bit more information, but might also help explain why Hurt and Hearn are researching werewolves. What if Armbjorn was sent after them to begin with? After all, he would be immune to vampirism, but was ultimately unsuccessful in claiming Hearn's life, and now they're preparing for the chance he might come back. Furthermore, if you declare yourself to be here on behalf of the Dark Brotherhood, Hearn will be unsurprised and unfazed that you've come for him. Assassin versus vampire, a fight for the ages.
Ah, so the Brotherhood has come for old Hearn, has it? Well then, let us meet as equals.
We don't even declare that we're the Dark Brotherhood specifically, we're simply declaring that we're an assassin. And there are other assassin guilds and the like in the Elder Scrolls. Hearn's accurate deduction that we are representing the Dark Brotherhood specifically may very well speak to a rational train of thought, but I'd like to think he and Hurt have had experience with the likes of us before. Once the contract has been picked up, even if we choose to remain silent, Hearn has a pretty good idea of what kind of individual stands before him.
Don't say much, but there's a strange aura about you. You walk in the shadow of death. Leave here. Leave here and never return. You really don't want to be loitering here, stranger.
So that might very well explain that. But you gotta wonder, who would hire the Dark Brotherhood to kill a couple vampires? Why would you go that route rather than expose the vampires for who they are? To avoid retribution perhaps? Or to guarantee a capable combatant is unleashed against them? As for why somebody would take it upon themselves to do such a thing, perhaps it was a relative of one of Hurt and Hearn's victims, who discovered the truth behind their loved one's fate and took matters into their own hands. After all, according to Nazir, Hurt and Hearn have been blended with society for years, which is a long time to be preying on unsuspecting travellers undetected. However, the hole in the theory that these vampires once faced Armbjorn is that Nazir refers to this as a new contract. I mean, you could argue he withheld the contract until you proved you were capable enough to handle it, and it has in fact been on the back burner for a while, but by that point we're well and truly down the rabbit hole that I like to refer to as bollocks. So could there be another possible explanation? Or is the morbid reading material just that? If they were avid or even casual readers, you'd expect to see more books in their possession. The solitary aspect of the discovery of this book that revolves around the experimentation on werewolves is emphasis within itself. It feels like it has some purpose. In fact, it feels even more purposeful when you realise there are only 3 fixed locations where this book will reliably spawn, and one of the other locations is Castle Falkreath. Could this imply a connection with that vampire stronghold? Not directly, but there does appear to be some vampire interest in the physicalities of werewolves. Is that because the morbid lifestyle of a vampire fosters a desire for morbid entertainment, or is it research for some purpose? All I know is, under the right circumstances, lycanthropy purges vampirism and vice versa. But if Hurt and Hearn were pursuing a cure, wouldn't they be searching for means far less prone to causing total carnage, as is sure to be the case should they replace their controlled vampire abilities with the difficult to control transformations of a werebeast? It makes no sense, and likely wouldn't improve their quality of life at all, as in they'd still find themselves ripping people to shreds, albeit far less subtly. So I still think the idea that they've had to deal with a werewolf problem of some description makes far more sense. Moving off of that, before I lose my mind over what could very well just be a book, and not an indicator of a broader conspiracy, there are some other noteworthy aspects to Hurt and Hearn here. For instance, how unusual it is for vampires to opt to blend with society, and not just seclude themselves as much as possible as most do. Why are these two taking that risk? By running a lumber mill and trading, and aiding the economy of the region? Is it purely to make the hunting of people easier? Because the vampires who dwell in caves seem to get by just fine as well. It's not even like their appearance is subtle. Or is it? Like I said before, their appearance was updated thanks to the Dawnguard expansion. You see, there are many kinds of vampires. The Falkreath vampires that DLC is centered around have their vampiric nature on full display, and prior to the installation of this expansion in the original version of Skyrim, Hurt and Hearn looked far less monstrous. There were still some alarming features, but nowhere near as in-your-face as glowing orange eyes, or in Hurt's case a nose bridge that looks like it's been repeatedly introduced to a frying pan hourly for 25 years. And yet the guards who patrol this place diligently, day and night, never seem to twig onto these unnatural prominent features. Is it because they're too stupid to see the obvious, or can they just not see it at all? What I'm trying to say is the adjustment to the appearance of the average vampire rather than the Falkreath vampires the Dawnguard DLC is focusing on may only exist to the player's perception. So the glowing orange eyes aren't actually there for everyone else, meaning the only way the average traveller would be able to detect vampirism in Hurt and Hearn is if they got so close their chances of survival dwindled to 0. Could it be a technical overcorrection to make vampires look inhuman? Or could it be us seeing through powerful illusion magic that works on almost every other living being that knows what a vampire is? After all, we are the Dragonborn, so it would make sense that we can see more than most. It would certainly make more sense than everybody else perceiving them the same way we do. And of course the concept of vampires being able to blend in so seamlessly is not a novel thing. Take for instance the Order of Virtuous Blood in the Imperial City in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, a vampire hunting society headed by a fellow named Cerida, and as we explore that quest we discover that Cerida is in fact a vampire himself. And well, this Cerida was completely absent of vampiric features, What this means is it's entirely possible for vampires to not have any distinct features, or indeed are able to create illusions to make themselves look flush among others. So if we're just seeing through that illusion with Hurt and Hearn, their decision to hide in plain sight may not be that big a risk after all. And there is no denying they do conduct a legitimate logging business, albeit with a side hustle of feeding on passers-by, which undoubtedly won't win them any friends. Another noteworthy detail is the fact that neither Hurt nor Hearn seem remotely bothered by the sun. Admittedly, I noticed their routine can get skewed quite easily. Sometimes they're out logging in the day, other times they're doing it at night. However, regardless, they don't seem to be suffering any negative impacts from doing so, which may be a bug. As part of the Dawnguard DLC, should you use Auriel's bow to shoot the sun, apparently these two vampires have been reported to rejoice that the tyranny of the sun is over, which would be a peculiar thing to say if it didn't affect you at all. But if this lack of weakness is intentional, it tells us which strain of vampirism these two contracted, of which there are three main strains: porphyric haemophilia, sanguinaire vampiris, and noxophilic sanguivoria. Those affected by porphyric haemophilia and sanguinaire vampiris are significantly weakened during the day. However, those suffering from noxophilic sanguivoria are not. So I suppose that can be explained away with relatively minimal fuss. And as one last thing, they have very similar names. Hurt and Hearn do not sound like the names of a married couple, rather siblings. And even then, only if you were twins and your parents hated you from the moment you spawned. It's clear the game is aware of this potential confusion and voices it through the guard, leaving us to decide if we think Hurt and Hearn are married, siblings, or indeed both. But I don't think we need the added depravity for some reason, and with all of that explored, there's only one thing left to be done. To conclude, Half Moon Mill is run by a pair of vampires, who may very well run an authentic logging business, but on the side they've been preying on the people of Falkreath Hold, not to mention passing travellers, for far too long. And for that, they must die. There are two real requirements for facing vampires in combat. One of them is to go prepared, and the other is to bring a potion of cure disease that somehow cures all ills. Only then can we engage these vile creatures. If you're set on eradicating them both, it's probably advisable to kill Hurt first. She may rush to the aid of Hearn, but should he fall, she'll run away. And with that, Half Moon Mill no longer has a vampire problem. On their bodies, there are keys to Half Moon Mill, nothing else unique, aside from confirmation that we were indeed dealing with vampires, but we were well past convinced, and thus we can venture forth resting easy knowing that whatever threat resided here, it's been dealt with now. Though it might be worthwhile to turn the contract into Nazir and, get paid.
No sarcasm this time. You faced a vampire and lived to tell the tale. Well done. And if you contracted sanguinare vampiris, be sure to get that taken care of, else you'll end up like our own Babette. Unless, of course, that was your goal all along. Here's your payment.
And that brings us to the end of today's video. Thank you all for watching. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, share the channel with your friends, all that wonderful stuff. It would be massively appreciated. Perhaps bang me a follow on some social media if you want to keep up with whatever else I do for some reason. And perhaps bang that notification bell on as well if you want more content like this. And of course, be sure to let me know your thoughts and theories down in the comments section. I'm not sure when the next video will be. I'm off to Germany for a couple of days, so I presume it will be after I get back. But feel free to let me know which topics you'd like to see covered in future installations in not just this series, but perhaps other games as well. At some point I'd like to add some Oblivion stuff to this repertoire and so on, and also maybe branch out into Fallout eventually. I'm very single-tracked in my head, so when I get an idea for a playlist, I like to pad it out before moving on to the next thing, which is why there's a bit of a Skyrim bias at the moment. And with my desire to ramble satisfied, with any luck I'll be seeing you all very soon with another video at some point, but until next time, please take care and goodbye.